Let's go back to Baker Street. Home, sweet home. There we are, Holmes. I've told you in great detail everything that happened last night.
Excellent work, Watson. We shall now be prepared to answer a few questions about the horrible murder in Hanbury Street.
Do you think we are now in a position to find out the identity of the murderer of these two women?
No, I don't think so. It's outside of our scope and not our responsibility. As much as you've done for Leather Apron and the affair with the pills, our mission is to help the police by ensuring that they don't get caught up following false leads and to point them in the right direction. Let us start from what we know with some certitude. As you have just said, it is almost certain that the same person killed the Bucks Row and Hanbury Street victims. The reason to assume as much are numerous, and I shan't elaborate here. What do these two victims have in common?
It's true these two women were in the same profession, but...
Indeed, Watson, these two women were both prostitutes. That is of vital importance, Watson.
My memory from your examination of the scene is rather hazy. Didn't you say something about the killer's frame of mind?
I was talking about the victim's possessions that were placed on the ground and the rings missing from Annie Chapman's fingers. This killer is a cunning predator, comes from a rather humble background, and shows steely self-control in carrying out the murders.
Something is puzzling me, Holmes. Richardson's testimony contradicts the time of death given by Dr. Phillips, which also matches my own, 4:30 a.m.
And yes, we shall confirm that, Watson, and attempt to determine the precise time of death. In order to do that, we will need to place everyone involved on a timeline. Only after that will we be able to place the knife symbolizing our killer. Let's look at our timeline, Watson. Let's put the time of death as assessed by Dr. Phillips on the timeline. The assessment of the time of the murder given by Dr. Phillips and yourself, Watson, 4:30 a.m. Now, for the most important part, the testimony of Miss Long. She claims to have seen a woman speaking to a man near 29 Hanbury Street sometime around... What time, Watson? Let us assume, therefore, that Miss Long's testimony is, as is most certainly the case, true. She places her meeting with the victim at around 5:30, claiming to have heard a clock chime on the half hour at the moment when she enters the street. Now, let's put the Richardsons' arrival and departure times on the timeline. Now, let's put the Richardsons' arrival and departure times on the timeline. Despite the great respect I have for Dr. Phillips and the value I place on our friendship, my deepest conviction is that both of you are mistaken and that Richardson is in the right and that these two testimonies put down in writing have real worth.
But how? Explain yourself, Holmes.
Remember how you assessed the time of death? You touched the fingers and body of the victim, but it was remarkably cold for this time of year. In addition, the corpse had been drained of bodily fluids. Its heat retention was therefore no longer the same as that of an intact corpse.
Egad! You're right, Holmes.
Oh, I've had some time to research, Watson.
Given these facts, my first diagnosis may have been off by half an hour, perhaps even an hour.
Thus, we can confirm Richardson's statement and establish that the murder was committed after 4:50 a.m. and not before 4:30 a.m. Our next witness is Albert Kadosh. Albert Kadosh goes down into his garden at approximately 5:20, and on re-entering his home, hears voices in number 29's garden. Let's place this symbol that represents Kadosh on the timeline. Kadosh goes back down into his garden approximately 4 minutes after having left it, and hears the sound of an impact against the wooden fence. Let's place this symbol that represents Kadosh on the timeline. Kadosh leaves the garden, enters his house, then leaves for work, seeing the clock on the Spitalfields church showing 5:32. We left the station at 6 o'clock and it took us 20 minutes to arrive at Hanbury Street. Our arrival at the scene occurred at around 6:20. Given the distance separating the two locations, we can deduce that the corpse wasn't discovered after 6 o'clock, and therefore that the murder must have been committed before. Excellent, Watson. All our people are now in place.
Yes, but Holmes, Miss Long claims to have seen the victim at around 5:30. But according to Kadosh, someone, most certainly the victim and her murderer, was already in the garden at 5:30.
Excellent observation, Watson. It must be noted, however, that these two witnesses, Long and Kadosh, saw the time shown on the clocks in the area, which are often inaccurate and went by their empirical and, in this case, erroneous estimate of how much time had passed. Thus, neither of these two times can be considered reliable.
Do you mean to say that these two testimonies might match?
Indeed. Let's put Miss Long's meeting with the victim at 2 minutes before 5:30. Let's add Miss Long's meeting with the victim at 2 minutes before 5:30 a.m. Mr. Kadosh claims to have passed by the Spitalfields church at 5:32, which, given the distance from 27 Hanbury Street, would mean he was still at home at 5:31. Let's therefore put the end of his testimony at 5:31. Miss Long heard the man say to the victim, "Will you do it?" To which the victim responded, "Yes," which would suggest that an agreement was reached and that the transaction was imminent. They then proceeded to enter the garden, which puts the voices heard by Kadosh at 5:29. We had thought that Kadosh had left 27 Hanbury Street at 5:31 after having heard an impact against the fence. Thus, 2 minutes passed between the moment when Kadosh entered the house after having been in the garden the first time and the moment when he returns to go out again and leave for work. How long did he estimate this interval to be? 3 to 4 minutes. In light of all this, Watson, we can finally establish the time of Chapman's murder. Now, place the knife at the exact time. Now then, taking into account that the local clock isn't exact and that a young man was off by a minute or two in his estimations of his comings and goings, we can confirm Miss Long's testimony and place the time of the crime at approximately 5:30.
But in that case, Holmes, the man that Miss Long saw is none other than...
That's right, Watson. It was the Whitechapel killer.
To think that Miss Long and Kadosh were only a few feet away from him.
Indeed, Watson. Had Miss Long passed just a little closer to the victim and her assassin, or had the young Kadosh popped his head over the fence out of curiosity, the killer would most certainly already be behind bars.
That's some stroke of luck he had there.
I couldn't agree more, Watson. But his luck didn't end there, given the mutilations inflicted upon this poor woman. What must be considered above all is the killer's obvious wish to remove one and only one specific organ. His surgery pinpointed the exact spot, avoiding superfluous incisions. This suggests the man possesses at least a minimal anatomical knowledge.
Are you suggesting a doctor or a butcher?
Perhaps, but the possibilities are still too broad to conclude with any certainty. Now for the motive. Despite my almost complete lack of practical experience on the subject, I have a rather precise idea of the usefulness of a uterus and a vagina. Nonetheless, once they are separated from their usual envelope, I am more circumspect as to the uses one can make of them. What do you think, Watson? We need a board, Watson. There is nothing more to do here.
Perhaps it was intended as a study specimen.
I have little faith in that theory. Hardly anything was taken from the Bucks Row victim.
Black magic?
Watson, this line of investigation is far too vague. We don't have a single clue in support of such a motive. We can eliminate this hypothesis.
Holmes, what if it was cannibalism?
Even if the idea is unbearable, we can't ignore it as a possibility.
A desire for some sort of morbid trophy.
I'd be inclined to dismiss this motive. If this were the case, why would nothing have been removed from the Bucks Row victim? Elementary. What emerges from these possible motives for having removed the uterus from the second victim is that they implied that the killer could have carried out the same thing on the Bucks Row victim, yet didn't. This brings us to a terrible conclusion. Our killer has evolved in the space of only a few days, and if that's the case, had he already struck before the first murder to which we attribute them? And if the killer strikes again, what atrocity awaits his next victim?
We have to stop him, Holmes.
We shall do our best. This recent business of jars filled with formalin and of the American doctor might be a lead. Watson, inquire among medical circles to ascertain if there is a black market for human organs. The chances are slim, but this must be pursued.
Very well. What about you, Holmes?
I will send word to Aberline regarding our recent conclusions. I should also like to become a gas man and pay a visit to Bluto at the Wasp's Nest.
Understood, Holmes. I think one of my old university colleagues who works at the London hospital will be able to help me. I shall write him a note at once. He should be able to see me during the day. Afterwards, shall we meet here?
Yes, Watson. See you later, and good luck.
I must get to the London hospital where my old university colleague works.